All right, I want to welcome everybody. Good evening, and thank you for being here with us. We are recording this session, and we will send out the recording link tomorrow in a follow-up email to everyone who registered. We are reserving the camera and the mic for just the presenters, and we are using Zoom webinar as our platform. This session is sponsored by GBH, formerly known as WGBH up until just a few days ago. We are Boston's public media station and the leader in producing award-winning primetime shows and educational programs for PBS and NPR. Shows such as American Experience, Frontline, Nova, Masterpiece, Molly of Denali, Pinkalicious, etc., all originate at GBH. Forgot to show you our fancy new logo and color scheme. We are also sponsored this evening by PBS LearningMedia, which is a collaboration between PBS and WGBH. It is a free site of thousands of resources, digital resources for classroom use. Everything is aligned to state and national standards, and easily just search and navigate the site and save things and share them. The resources that we'll be highlighting tonight in a few minutes are all available on PBS LearningMedia. I am Carolyn Jacobs, and I'm thrilled to be here and have you join us. I'm in the education department at GBH, and thank you so much for joining us. 2020 marks the 100th anniversary of the passage of the 19th Amendment, protecting women's constitutional right to vote. The Vote is a 4-hour American Experience documentary telling the dramatic and surprisingly unfamiliar crusade waged by women for the right to vote. It was originally broadcast on public media stations around the country in July, and it is now being rebroadcast on consecutive Tuesday evenings that started a couple of days ago, so you can check your local PBS listings. Also, you can go to the Vote website and stream the entire program. Tonight, we're focusing on the role of African American women suffragists, and our main presenter is Dr. Marcia Chatelain, author and professor of history and African American studies at Georgetown University. Marcia's most recent book was published earlier this year, Franchised: The Golden Arches in Black America. And it centers around the very troubling success story of how fast food became one of the greatest generators of Black wealth in America, and of course, often blamed for the rising rates of obesity and diabetes among Black Americans. Marcia is one of the historians featured in The Vote from American Experience, and we are honored to have her with us this evening. Marcia is joined by Sue Wilkins. Prior to joining GBH in the education department in 2019, Sue taught social studies for 20 years, and also most recently, she served as the education director at the International Museum of World War II in Natick, Massachusetts. And we're also thrilled to have Karen Pleasant with us. Karen is a teacher. She is the History Department Chair and International Baccalaureate Coordinator at Stoneleigh Burnham School in Greenfield, Mass. And she currently serves as a GBH Educator Ambassador. So the plan for tonight is that we're going to kick things off with Sue, who will introduce the just published classroom resources that are drawn from the program, The Vote. Marcia will follow with about a 30-minute presentation on the role of African American women. And then Karen will give us a teacher's perspective and some instructional ideas. And then I'll come back on at the end for some announcements. You are welcome to post questions in the Q&A. Also, you can make use of the chat to interact with your colleagues and the presenters. We will do our best to get to the Q&A. We may have some time at the end to just pause and look at the Q&A also, but we'll try and respond. And we have Matul from the Education Department at GBH who will be monitoring the chat and the Q&A. So I'm going to turn it over to Sue Wilkins.
Great, thank you, Carolyn, and welcome everybody. I'm just going to take a few minutes to share with you the learning media resources that we've created based on the vote and that are now available for you on our site. For those of you who are new to learning media, what we do is work with some of these wonderful American experience films, and we create classroom-ready digital media resources and support materials for you and your students. And in thinking about where to focus and what topics and themes to highlight, we look for underrepresented voices, stories, and perspectives that often are not fully covered in the typical survey textbook. So with respect to the vote, we developed these following resources. This one here is what I think of as sort of a foundational resource that focuses on the Seneca Falls Convention, which I think is a topic that many teachers cover in their classrooms. Every resource is built on an essential question and some supporting questions, which you can see here on the slide. There's a 4-minute clip excerpted from the vote, and there are teaching tips available to you on the site. And those are essentially suggestions on how you could use this resource in your classroom and with your students. Okay, next slide. This resource focuses on the racial divide in the suffrage movement, and this is a very prominent theme in the film The Vote, and something that I think is not often given enough attention in survey history courses. So here again, you can see our essential question and the supporting questions. This particular resource actually is comprised of 3 different video clips from the vote. Each one is roughly 4 to 6 minutes long, but they all focus on this central theme and this essential question. This resource also comes with a background reading, which is written for educators, but is certainly something that you could use, and with some, with some tailoring, you could share with your students, or if you have higher level reading students, you could just share it with them as it is. And there are also teaching tips that come along with this resource. Okay, next slide. Great, this resource looks at another really strong theme, I think, in the vote, which are the sort of different tactics used by suffragists. In this particular resource, we focused on sort of 2 wings of the suffragist movement, those followers of Alice Paul and those followers of Carrie Catt. And all of this is taking place around World War I, when women are having to decide, are they going to sort of stay in the struggle for suffrage, or are they going to put that aside and get behind the war effort? In this resource, there are actually 4 video clips, all related to this issue, this topic. Again, all of these clips are around 4 to 6 minutes in length. There's a different background reading here as well, and teaching tips. All right, and lastly, so American Experience actually put together a really interesting interactive called She Resisted: Strategies of Suffrage. So I'm not going to go into this in too much detail because I know Karen is going to speak to this later. But what I do want to say is that what we did was we developed all of these support materials that you see on the right-hand side of the screen to facilitate your using this interactive with your students. And we designed it this was all done fairly recently, so we designed this knowing that not everybody would be back in the classroom this fall. So this is something that you can use synchronously or asynchronously. And as you can see, there are quite a number of support materials here for you, including a student activity and worksheet. All right, so that's what we've developed. And again, that's all available now on Learning Media. And it is now my pleasure to turn things over to Marcia.
Thank you so much, Susan. Hi, everyone, and it is so exciting to be in community with so many educators. Before we were sent home, I spent a lot of time through various PBS programs with K through 12 educators in the National Endowment for the Humanities programs. And so I always feel at home having conversations with people who are teaching students at various levels of their exploration of history. And today, I want to think with you about how to bring the story of African-American women and the suffrage movement into larger context to help students understand that while the fight for the vote was critical as a step in the right direction for women's civil rights, this was not the only activity that was undertaken by women of all communities. And for African-American women in particular, other activities outside of voting, because of the barriers to voting, were essential for African-American women to develop leadership skills, to understand their influence on public policy, social policy, community relations outside of the context of the vote. And it's because they were engaged in so much institution building, the fight for the vote was one in which they had both the skills and the energy to undertake. So I'm going to share my slides with you, which I've been doing quite a bit now that we're teaching online. And I'll talk to you about some historic figures that can really help you bring added context to the material if you decide to screen it with your students. And so one of the figures that we have the pleasure of spending time with during the documentary is Ida B. Wells Barnett. She appears in the vote in the context of her work on women's suffrage as the leader of the Alpha Suffrage Club, as a woman who in Chicago was instrumental in the election of the first African-American congressman from Illinois, as well as her work in galvanizing African-American women at the historic suffrage march, in which she refused to be Jim Crowed, to march behind white women. And so in the context of this film, we have a very clear idea of the ways that Ida B. Wells was striving for the vote, not just for herself, but on behalf of African-American women broadly. And I think this is a wonderful opportunity to introduce your students to Ida B. Wells's complexity, as well as her influence in areas outside of the suffrage movement. And so one way you can do that is to talk about her work as an investigative journalist, as the writer of such publications as The Red Record, which was an exploration of the problem of lynching in the South. For those of you who teach younger students, lynching, of course, involves the public and spectacular violence that was often targeted towards African Americans across the country, but had become an issue of critical importance in the South. I think the best way to contextualize Ida B. Wells' story to probably a younger student base is to talk about the ways that fear overwhelmed African Americans in daily life. The Red Record was an extension of Ida B. Wells Barnett's concerns about the ways that lynching, these extra legal measures of violence, were used to discipline and intimidate African Americans for exercising autonomy and success. Her own experience with lynching included the death of 3 of her very good friends who were owners of People's Grocery. And the importance of Ida B. Wells to lynching and then later to suffrage, I think, is connected by her own personal experience of changing her perspective and her mind. We are in a moment in which people often ask if we're in the most kind of politically divided moment in American history. I don't know if we're quite there yet, but I think that due to the perhaps hyper-partisan way in which people express themselves, in which young people are being introduced to the idea of political debate, I think it's always important to highlight historical figures who have a change of heart or a change of perspective as a result of an experience. And for Ida B. Wells Barnett, she was not born an anti-lynching advocate, but the death of her friends and the ability to see the way that violence and terror were shaping African-American life compelled her towards this life of activism. And so after she essentially flees the South, she flees Memphis, Tennessee, and she goes to Chicago, she establishes herself as a voice for African-American people and women in particular in different modes. And so one of the striking features of Ida B. Wells Barnett's biography is that she is understanding the relationship between the ability and the power to vote and the pressing needs of African Americans in a number of places. In my first book, Southside Girls, Growing Up in the Great Migration, I highlight the way that Ida B. Wells Barnett was an advocate for children who had been orphaned during the Great Mass Migration of African Americans from the South to the North. So she was front and center in debates about foster care, the adoption of African American children, the issue of the criminalization of the poor, in which poor Black children would be arrested and put in juvenile facilities, even though they had committed no crimes. She was an advocate on behalf of the image of African-American women. One of the reasons why she becomes the motivation for the creation of the National Association of Colored Women is because she's besmirched. Her reputation is besmirched by a newspaperman in Missouri. And so there's a way that the multiplicity of her activist work becomes an excellent object lesson for the ways that a person who is committed to justice is able to animate that commitment on a number of issues. And I think for those of you who teach students at the high school level, especially the older high school students, this is a moment in which I think a lot of young people are discerning their purpose and their path, what they should care about, what does it mean to be an activist? And I think that Ida B. Wells Barnett provides us an excellent opportunity to think about being anchored in a commitment to justice and finding the various places in which your leadership is necessary. In addition, her writings from A Red Record to her pamphlet at the 1893 World's Fair to her musings in her autobiography provide us some wonderful textual tools to examine the ways that these debates were framed. And so if the vote is the first introduction to Ida B. Wells Barnett for your classes, there are all of these wonderful directions that you can take her biography in order to help students understand what was at stake in Black women's pursuit of the vote and what are the various community issues that they identified as linked to the ability to participate in the democracy. Another place in which we see an important African-American woman contributing to the political culture of Black life is the temperance movement. And this is Amanda Berry Smith, who was a member of the African Methodist and Episcopal Church. She was considered a great evangelist of Black people. She had the distinction of preaching before mixed race and mixed gender crowds. In our recent conversation with another person who appeared in the film, Martha Jones, who just wrote a book called Vanguard about Black women and voting, she identifies Amanda Berry Smith and her work as a religious leader as key to creating, again, a ground and territory for Black women to participate in advocacy and in civil society before they were able to access the vote. One of the wonderful ways that this documentary provides an opportunity to tell a richer and broader story of people's lives is in the absence of the right to vote, how did women exercise their political power? And we see it throughout the film, in the gathering of conventions, in the writing of editorials, in direct action, nonviolent confrontation, and violent confrontation. We see the various ways that people leverage their votes. And for Amanda Berry Smith, a woman who was coming from a context of the religious tradition, she found her participation to bridge her religious conviction and her desire to do work for the public good in the temperance movement. And that was the movement to eradicate alcohol from civil society. And the temperance movement, from our 2020 eyes, may seem like a bunch of people who just hated alcohol, which is part of it. But one of the reasons that women were involved in the temperance movement is they were concerned about men's behaviors and action when they were under the influence of alcohol. And they used temperance as a way to critique the way that men may have abused their power and other people. And so concern about drunkenness in the household and domestic violence, drunkenness as a way of understanding men's uncivil behavior towards women, concerns about sexual assault and the treatment of women domestics was very much tied in to this question of temperance. And this was a place in which we see the kind of interracial movement building that was sometimes even not present in the suffrage movement. And so if we teach students as the suffrage movement as a real challenge to interracial cooperation, we can see the ways that the temperance movement in some moments was successful in bringing Black and white women together under the banner of prohibition. And then we can also see the fissures in that movement. In fact, Ida B. Wells was early in the temperance movement, and she had a great rift with one of the most influential members of that movement, Frances Willard of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, over the issue of lynching. And Willard would not denounce lynching, and she also was accommodating to the Southern impulses of Jim Crow, the same ones that Ida B. Wells Barnett is fighting against at the suffrage march. So there's a really elegant way that you can show how these political movements are intertwined. And at the center of them are women who have a vision of what a better world looks like, but such disagreements about the pathways as well as the various accommodations that you make for it. You may have missed the news, but this is an election year. I know it happens every 4 years. And in order to create a productive space for students to talk about politics, sometimes our best strategies is to talk about politics in the past in order to help them engage the questions of politics in the present. And so one activity that I love to do when I have the privilege of teaching high school students is I give students various roles in these different historical scenarios. And I don't say defend that person's position, but to outline what they believed was at stake and what was lost by pursuing that path. And so when we think about the tensions among the question of race, we can say, what would it mean for suffrage movement leaders to exclude African Americans? What did they believe they were gaining? And what do we know by our perspective today, what they lost in the process? And so the temperance movement provides us this opportunity. Organizations are so key to African American life, especially after the end of slavery, and they become critical after the end of Reconstruction. And so the organizations that African American women create and join throughout the late 19th and early 20th century become the foundation of our understanding of Black women today in local and national politics. And so one of the critical places in which you can guide your students is an exploration of the National Association of Colored Women, which was established in 1896, inspired by the fact that Ida B. Wells Barnett had been insulted by a journalist based out of Missouri when she traveled to England on behalf of the anti-lynching cause. So you start to see these political movements, they're threaded together, and they are so productive because essentially James Jacks says that Ida B. Wells is a woman of low moral character, and Ida B. Wells is never one to demur to a fight. And so a group of Black women start the National Association of Colored Women in the vein of in defense of ourselves. that they are the ones who are responsible for sticking up for their good name, showing their capacity to do good works, and in the process, they create a national movement. And the infrastructure of those colored women's clubs become essential for the type of political activism that will be animated in the 20th century suffrage fight. Because if we can imagine a world without all of our technologies, and my students, they bristle at the fact that that was actually a world, but I often say, how do you get 100,000 people to do the same thing at the same time and the same day without the benefit of telephones? What are the routes that allow for women to know that the suffrage march is going to happen? You know, when we talk about the March on Washington in 1963, how do you get 250,000 people to do the same thing at the same time on the same day? It takes a level of political and organizational maturity. And that is how Black women were able to create these incredible campaigns. They had these local level organizations, this national body of support, and they also left behind an incredible archive of newspapers and memos. Some of this material is digitized and can be brought into the classroom very easily. I know that from other PBS documentaries, there are items from the National Association of Colored Women Leaders. And in the film, you have Ida B. Wells Barnett and Mary Church Terrell and other women who were club women as well as suffrage advocates. So this is an excellent opportunity to introduce your students to this type of institution building. And the motto, lifting as we climb, is not incidental. It is fundamentally what Black women believe will happen, that as they gain more civil rights, as they gain more entree into voting and to participation, they are bringing with them an entire people. And it is that kind of sensibility that allows Black women to sustain their interest and desire for politics, even in the face of the rejection from members of the suffrage movement, even in the face of the inability to actually exercise the right to vote after the passage of the 19th Amendment. And so the last two organizations I want to introduce to you before I turn it over to my colleague, Karen, are Black women's sororities. And by the early 20th century, the National Association of Colored Women becomes such an important and powerful force. But the Black women's sororities are adding another layer of that political power, because by virtue of their identity as organizations for college-educated women, they are making a very important distinction in their representation as women who are able to excel in academics, as well as people who are among the very, very elite of African-American life. Although all of the women who were the early founders of the two first Black sororities that were founded at Howard University, Alpha Kappa Alpha in 1908 and Delta Sigma Theta in 1913, although these women were not entirely from the kind of most elite Black families at the time, they were engaging with the most notable figures and the most powerful figures of Black America just by virtue of going to college. And in that way that these Black women are appearing in public as women who are equally educated as the men around them, this is an incredibly profound issue for women of all colors. And so as college women, they see themselves as having the potential to consolidate their power in new spaces. And it is no coincidence, again, my lighting is going out in this room. This is work from home, pardon me. I'm trying to adjust it the best I can. You know, as these women are participating in the suffrage march in 1913, that's not a coincidence that this is the first act that Delta Sigma Theta does as a new sorority. That the first thing that they want the public to understand is the importance of their social activism in Washington, D.C. And so Black women's sororities provide us a wealth of history and context on the various ways that Black women are identifying themselves as leaders, and they're also confronting a great deal of sexism on the college campuses in which they're pursuing their education. And the final group that I think is probably the lesser known of all of the great kind of Black women's organizations, because they're often kind of in the background of African American history, but I want to make a strong case for introducing students to organizations like the Association of Negro Life and History, which was established in 1915 by Carter G. Woodson, who created Negro History Week, which would evolve into Black History Month, but the importance of literary societies, groups of people who convene together to read books and to debate issues of national importance, was so critical in the intellectual formation of Black women, as well as a place where Black women who were librarians and scholars were able to participate in scholarly discourse. And those ideas would be reproduced in African American magazines, published by groups like the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. This is how ideas were disseminated. This is how people were moved to action around issues of voting, issues of anti-lynching. And these societies were co-ed. They were one of the few kind of co-ed spaces where scholars and students could come together. They were mixed gender places where men and women could debate serious issues. And they were spaces in which the cultural production and the value of African American thought was revered. And that becomes so important because that provides the foundation for what's being taught at the Black colleges and universities, where these women are learning new ideas and going out in the world, not just as activists, but also as teachers in communities in which segregation limited so much of the educational opportunities for African American youth. And so with that, I think I've made a pretty compelling case for studying all of these other organizations. And so when we look at this period of time before the vote, and we look at the challenges that African American women faced in the suffrage movement, they are mirrored in the challenges they faced in other movements in other parts of society. But what we see is a real innovation in approach. We see these incredible training grounds for learning new skills. And we are heartened by the fact that this work continued after the passage of the 19th Amendment and went until the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And next time we all gather again, we can talk about why the vote is an excellent opportunity to then tell the stories of the Black women who not only embraced their voting rights by registering to vote and voting in every election, but who ran for public office. Women like Shirley Chisholm and Fannie Lou Hamer and Annie Devine, and the numerous women who cleared the path so that Kamala Harris's entry into the vice presidential race is interesting, but not as earth-shattering as it could have been had these women not existed. And so Black women's history helps us add nuance to the limits and possibilities of the vote. And I'm so excited for all of the excellent ways that you're going to translate this into your own classrooms. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marcia. I am really struck about how much there is to learn about the experience of Black women before the vote, and really how important this film, The Vote, is, and the interactives that we're showing you tonight, how important those are for our teaching and our students. So thank you so much for joining us. I'm learning a lot tonight. I hope you are, and I hope that I can guide you a little bit on how to use some of these things additionally in the classroom. Resources, I will just emphasize again on PBS LearningMedia, are excellent, and my students have loved them, and I always think of myself as looking for a partner in my teaching. And I really, really feel that these resources are one of my partners, and they work in such a great way. Students get super engaged. Depending on how some of the resources are used, students can work at their own pace. And there's all kinds of integration, as you've seen, between film and artifacts and articles, and there's lots of support for you as teachers. And they're really, really engaging. So please take a look. I specifically am going to talk tonight about the American experience and the vote interactive. So I could have the next slide, please. Thank you. So you can see that the theme is She Resisted and Strategies of Suffrage. What you're going to experience when you look at this interactive is it highlights the tactics and the people and the gains and losses in the movement and tries to show a great large picture of a decade that leads into 1920. Within this interactive, there is so much that I am not going to be able to cover it in this brief time tonight, but you will find quotes, photos, silent video, lots of explanation that walks you through various parts of the vote and things from the film. So there's a lot of information here that you can learn by just using the interactive by itself. I'm going to highlight just a few things and a few ways that I have thought about using this in my classroom. We are starting in my school, our very first class day is Monday. We've been in some orientation, so I've been thinking a lot about how my students can really benefit from using this interactive. For this particular interactive, we have already showed earlier in this webinar that there have been some things generated for you to use, but you're going to be the driving force, you teachers, on how you really want to use this interactive. And I'm going to give you a little bit of my view. So just a couple ideas is to watch the film or parts of the film with your students, and then hopefully they're really excited to dig deeper, particularly about strategies, and then you can use that as your support. I'm going to use this as a springboard. It does an excellent job about educating various aspects. So like I said, you can, of voting, so you could start here and learn a lot. I'm going to use this for discussions about activism and how women in particular use strategies for change and how they think about citizens' rights and how to gain the rights that people feel that they should have. And clearly that links to exactly what we are living through right now with the Black Lives Matter movement, issues about voting and the coronavirus and making voting possible for all, representation of women in politics. I'm really going to use this as a springboard to get into some of those conversations. For those of you here tonight that are more literary minded, there is a lot of information, as we've already heard about a couple of really outstanding women in this movement. There are many, many more within this interactive that you will be introduced to and that you can learn more about. And one of the other things that I find really fascinating with this, and this is my own personal bias, but I love the visual journey that this interactive takes us on. And you will see amazing photos and primary source video. And some of these photos, which is noted when you go into the interactive, have been colorized. And I find that for those of you that are teaching aspects of art, a really interesting piece here. And you can see from this image that we're looking at that it has been colorized. We go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So now I'm going to get all of you involved in thinking about how you might be able to use this. One of the things that I think a lot about when I'm teaching is how do I create the desire to learn with my students? How do I create that desire? So here is one way. If you showed this image to students, now in the chat box, I believe Matul has put this question in the chat box for all of you to respond to. If you showed this image to students, what guiding question for analysis might you ask them? So I want you to just take 30 seconds or so and think about, if you were to show this image, what question would you ask your students for analysis? Let's see if I can get into the chat and just see some of your answers here. What age brackets do you see represented, and why might that be significant? What are these women working to achieve? What did the colors of the pennants mean? Looking at background details. I'm assuming there's going to be a lot more going into the chat, and I won't read them all, but I encourage all of you, I won't read them all right now to you aloud, I should say. But I encourage all of you to do, now we have just crowdsourced a huge number of questions. There are a lot of photos throughout the interactive, and now using each other, and if you copy the chat or you pick out some of the questions that you're seeing that really strike you, we have just created a learning tool for all of you. So I really encourage you to read through as many of the questions as you can. Now, I really hope that I have created the desire to learn for you wanting to know more about this photo, but I'm not going to tell you more about it. I'm going to encourage you to go to PBS LearningMedia, and one of the things that we just highlighted at the beginning, divided tactics in pursuit of the 19th Amendment that was shared with you tonight, is going to give you some historical context about what this image is about. Next slide. Thank you. I'm going to show just a couple of things that are features of the Vote Interactive. And the first one that I'm going to show you is the suffrage map. This is an interactive map. This is an image, so I will not be interacting with it, but I'm encouraging you to go there and look. There are a lot of things that you can do with this, and teachers can use it to create lessons, victories and defeats. And there's a lot of stories within this map. Just for a little guidance, on the right-hand side, you can see that you can pick your year. I have picked the year 1914 is what we are looking at. And the little star on the bottom, if you see a star somewhere, you click on that and hear a story. Things I want to do with this map are do some comparison and contrast of just looking at different times and different states. And that's a really easy one for kids of all levels. What do you see that's different? What's the same? What are you noticing? Regional issues for maybe some older kids. You know, who got the vote first? Who was last? Why? And this could lead to short research projects on particular states. I am very, very interested in historical context. So when I look at this map, I really think about the southern states in particular and what was happening there. And the very first southern state to win, for women to win the right to vote, was Louisiana, and that was not until 1918. So if you were to click on 1918, you would hear a little bit more about that story. But the context in which that happened was that Black men were being prevented from voting at that time while the state was moving towards women being able to vote. So always thinking about contextually, like, what is really the bigger picture here and what is going on? And Marcia really gave us a lot of other things to think about here. I picked this map of 1914 because as a visual and something to have you all create the desire to learn, I want you to just look at Nevada for a minute and think about, everything around Nevada on this map and everything in the West except for Montana has already won voting rights for women. So what's happening with Nevada? And I hope you're curious enough to go and take a look at why it was a standout. And women were using the slogan in 1914 about Nevada, Nevada next. And you can see from the surrounding states why that may have been their slogan. For those of you that are more interested in statistical data, there's a lot that you could do here if you're a math teacher in looking at census information or trying to get a sense of who was living in these states, what were some of the, and how might that impact how the vote was happening. Next slide, please. Thank you. And another feature is these interactive buttons, and these are strategies of suffrage. I'm going to highlight two of these for you. The one in the center, that's the hand with the writing utensil, represents women's clubs. And Marcia introduced us to some of the groups that are in this interactive. And you can see on the right-hand side that I've highlighted one there. I really, really encourage you to go look at these images. There's a lot of text that goes along with each of these pages to teach you about how these clubs for change were working, who was in them, and who they were. And the mobilization of Black women's organizations and how important they were, as Marcia said, not only for the vote, but for social change in their world and things that they saw that they wanted to have be different. And teachers could do a lot with these buttons. I think I'm going to use it in putting students into groups to go through as a group all of these buttons and analyze strategies, how they were and were not effective. And strategies here are some visual things, you know, posters, marches, lots of different things in here in terms of their strategies. Individually, you could have a student assign or pick one strategy, and you could do a jigsaw with students reporting out about a strategy and what they learned to teach their other students in your class. And one way I absolutely know I'm going to use this is the bottom right hand. There is a button that looks like a hand, and it looks like a ballot with a little check mark on it. And if you could move to the last slide, please. Thank you. That is called legacy. And the legacy button talks about post 1920 and a little bit about the things that Marcia highlighted in her last slide, and sort of the springboard to maybe the next webinar, as was pointed out. But one of the things I love about this for my students is there are pages in here of young women voters. And these women are thinking about voting for the first time. And it's really a place where your student, particularly if you're teaching a high school student, can see themselves in this interactive and in this film, The Vote. And I'm going to probably do exactly what you're seeing on the screen, with students putting together a little portfolio with an image and a quote for what they feel, how important voting is for them, what it means for them. And even if my students don't have the right to vote right now, they certainly can be active in helping other people who do have the right to vote. There are so many other things that I could share with you, but there is not time. So please, please look for yourself in this interactive and look at all the resources that we have created to help you with that. Thank you so much.
And thank you. I think that you can tell from the reactions in the chat box that we've hit a chord, and we're doing what we set out to do. We are a little ahead of schedule. Isn't that a refreshing change? And Marcia, I wanted to give you a chance to either comment further, or maybe if you've seen something in the Q&A, the chat that you would like to react to. I just need a couple of minutes prior to 8 o'clock to wind things down.
Well, there's a great question in the chat about Ida B. Wells Barnett and the 1893 Chicago World's Fair, which is a great question. The 1893 Chicago World's Fair did have a women's pavilion. That pavilion only allowed one Black woman to address the delegation, and her name is escaping me, I should know this. But Ida B. Wells was at the Chicago World's Fair with Frederick Douglass, and they had these pamphlets made up essentially saying, you know, where is the presence, the Black presence and the acknowledgement of Black people at the World's Fair. And so she was leafleting and boycotting in the very front, raising awareness about the ways that the Chicago World's Fair was rendering a world without African Americans. And later in the 1940s in Chicago, the Negro Exposition becomes a kind of response to the World Fair, and was a celebration of African American life and culture. And again, those literary societies were at the forefront of the promotion of Black history for the larger community. But she was there in protest. And if you ever wonder where she is in history, she's most likely in protest or about to protest, because she had a spirit that was designed for that. The Negro Exposition was also in Chicago. I believe it's from 1940. And this was important that it was in Chicago, because Chicago was really the premier city, I think, for African-American life and culture because of the Great Migration, which is the mass migration of African-Americans in the US between 1917 and 1970. And Chicago is such an important part of the story about African-Americans and suffrage, because the critical mass of Black people in Chicago was important not only for local level Black elected officials, but a number of Black women, again, ran for office on the local level in Chicago. One woman was Irene McCoy Gaines, who was a prominent member of the Republican Party, who had run for office throughout the 30s and 40s. And Chicago is also important because it becomes a place where we start to see the political realignment of African Americans from the Republican Party to the Democratic Party. You know, there were some white women who did support Black suffrage to some extent. I think some of the notables include Lucy Stone, who I don't think is in the vote, but Lucy Stone was very much a radical thinker. She believed that women should hold property in their own names. The expression of Lucy Stoner is a woman who, upon marriage, doesn't change her last name. And I think that she was more open to the idea of Black women's suffrage. There were some women who may have supported Black women's suffrage, but were not as vocal about it. And then there's different types of uneasy collaborations that happen throughout. Even though Alice Paul was noted for her opposition to supporting Black women, later in her life when she supports the Equal Rights Amendment, she does find advocates in women like Pauli Murray. So there's all of these kind of very different ways that this issue plays out. I think this may be the last two questions. Wow, look at all these questions that came in. I think I'm on a little bit of a delay. Can you talk of any other notable Black women who are involved in other anti-belligerent reform movements? I think some of the most important ones are women who later become part of the Black global radical tradition, women like Claudia Jones, women like Islanda Robeson, who's married to the actor Paul Robeson. They become part of that kind of critical and kind of questioning about the nature of race in the United States. And then you have the great civil rights attorneys, Dovie Roundtree Johnson, Constance Baker Motley. They will become the infrastructure for the civil rights cases in the 40s, 50s, and 60s that become so fundamental to shifting opportunity. And so I think that you can kind of think about it in terms of the club women, the philosophers, the intellectual thinkers, and then the generation of the legal scholars. And all three of these groups are interacting with each other over a period of time. And then it kind of paves the way for a more broader recognition of the different types of activists who will emerge during the civil rights movement. Some of them are college educated, some of them are attorneys, some of them are organic and grassroots activists. And then there are women who again, pivot to different issues. Like Rosa Parks, spends a lot of time investigating sexual assault and sexual violence. Then she's also engaged in the question of voting rights. And then, people recognize her on a larger scale because of the Montgomery bus boycott. But before that, she was part of a group called the Women's Political Council, which was doing a lot of the work that Black women's clubs were doing, convening women to think about the issue of civil society. All right, last one. Ida B. Wells and her relationship with the Chicago police. That's a very good question. I do not believe Ida B. Wells was ever arrested, but I'm glad that you brought up the 1919 race riot, because one activity that I think could be particularly powerful with students is have them, this might be good, very good for high school students, have them read snippets of different riot commission reports over the 20th century, and they'll see so much resonance with the issues we find today. In the New Yorker, Jill Lepore wrote a piece about the riot commission. And if you look at the ways that people talked about 1919 in Chicago, and then the uprising in Harlem in, I think, 35 and 40, and then if you look at, the Kerner Commission from 68, there's some real threads of the types of issues that people are dealing with, and police brutality appears in all of them. Black women physicians active in suffrage. I do not know that. That's a very good question. Black women's suffrage and literary clubs. The literary clubs continued. The Association for Negro Life and History is now the Association of African American Life and History. They just finished a virtual conference this year. They're a wonderful gathering of academic scholars, of genealogists, of people who just have an interest in history. And a lot of these clubs, they were formed as a result of segregation in public libraries. So they are very much the ways that programming happened in Black libraries in the days of segregation. The rift around the 14th Amendment between abolitionists, white women activists, were upset they had been left out of the 14th Amendment. Okay. How do you deal with this difficult topic? I think the best way to queue up students to the questions about abolition and the 14th Amendment and the differences in the suffrage movement is to explore the question of abolition. So you present to students, all of these people were anti-slavery. What did anti-slavery mean to these different types of abolitionists? And what students will then gain an appreciation of the fact that there are many paths to the same goal, and sometimes those paths create the discord that makes history interesting. And so you talk about some abolitionists believed in abolition but still supported segregation. Some abolitionists believed in total social equality. Some abolitionists believed in these schemes to repatriate Black people to Africa, right? So some people believed in agrarian utopianism, right? So you talk about these different ways and you say, can you say these people are all in the same movement? And you look at the ways they have these disagreements and say, okay, so you see how that happens? Now let's look at suffrage and let's look at the questions other than the right to vote that these different feminists were asking. Some women wanted to hold property. Some wanted to have the right to be sued in their own name. Some wanted, inheritance to be able to be kept in a way. Like there were all of these other kind of peripheral issues, and they're all under the umbrella of suffrage, but boy, do they have a different vision of it. And yes, the Zeta Phi Beta sorority, which is among the Black sororities, was founded on the campus of Howard University, as well as Alpha Kappa Alpha and Delta Sigma Theta in 1920. Sigma Gamma Rho was founded on the campus of Butler University in Indianapolis. All right, I think we're at time.
I think we are. Wow. We've had so many rich comments in the chat box. So thank you, Marcia, and thank you for extending and doing kind of extemporaneous Q&A. I was reminded of a recent event that we hosted with Goldie Mohammed. Have you crossed paths with her? She wrote Cultivating Genius, an equity framework for culturally and historically responsive literacy. And one of the foundations of her research is Black literacy societies. that she brings into her teaching to motivate, to inform about the value of literacy in Black history. Anyway, all right, I digress, but that, I'm going to share my screen for another quick minute. We have that video, or excuse me, that recording, along with many, many others that I'm going to go back to that a second, on the GBH Education YouTube page. So this is where we populate the recordings of all of our virtual sessions, of which there are many. This one will end up on the page also after we do some editing tomorrow, and we'll put it up on the page and you'll get the link to that. There is a post-webinar survey. Here is the link for it. Atul will also put that in the chat box, and you'll also get that in the follow-up email tomorrow, but you might want to do it real quickly just while it's uppermost in your mind. This is created by our research team. We take your comments very, very seriously, and they do inform our work, so we appreciate you giving us some feedback. If you would like to have a certificate of participation, there's an opportunity to download that at the end of the survey. Just a reminder that way in the beginning, I know that some of you had to join us a little late. Sue did a showcase of the 3 new resources that were just published on PBS LearningMedia that are drawn from the vote. And those links are also in the chat, and they're in the resource document, and they'll be in the email that you get tomorrow. I also wanted to bring up another favorite collection on PBS LearningMedia called Unladylike 2020. This is produced by WNET, which is the station in New York and the creator of American Masters. And this is a series of approximately 10-minute clips of so-called unladylike women in history who did amazing things. And there are a few who were involved in the suffrage movement, and I think there are 18 of them. And I've started to go through them, and they are inspiring. Wait, we are very active on social media, and I want to thank everyone. This was a pleasure to be a part of, and I myself have made lots of notes and I've added to my reading list, as I'm sure you have too. So thank you, Marcia Chatelain. Thank you for being such a friend of public media and being a part of this. Thank you, Karen, for sharing some very creative ideas. And Sue, my colleague in the education department, and Matul, who was in the chat and the Q&A box. So we'll keep the chat open for another couple of minutes. Wish you a lovely evening. I hope that the school year is getting off to a better start than you might have anticipated, and that we all will come out of this whole and having learned some things. Okay, thank you, everybody. Good evening.